In this lesson, we will look at the mechanisms of evolution. These agents of evolution can cause allele frequencies to change in a population. We have defined evolution as change in allele frequencies of a population over time. The changes of these allele frequencies can accumulate and cause changes in the overall population, which eventually can accumulate and cause the formation of a brand new species, a process called speciation. There are several mechanisms by which these changes in allele frequencies can occur. Before we look at the mechanisms, I want to point out that individuals do not evolve. The smallest unit of evolution is a population. Allele frequencies can change in a population. Individuals are always born with two alleles. They can have homozygous genotypes or heterozygous genotypes. However, their genotypes will not change, which means their allele frequencies will not change. You're born with the genes you have, and you're stuck with them for your whole life. We are going to investigate 4 ways to cause evolution. These 4 mechanisms include mutations, genetic drift, migration, also known as gene flow, and natural selection. Remember, we have talked about mutations in the previous unit. A mutation is a change in the DNA sequence. These changes can occur in a gene, where it's generally a problem, or they can occur in the junk DNA that does not code for anything. Mutations are generally deadly. They can cause disorders, disease, deformities, because they mess with the overall protein, which is the product of a gene. There are many kinds of mutations that we can look at. Some of the causes are spontaneous mutations, which are mistakes that occur during replication, radiation, which is when there is too much X-ray or UV damage to the DNA, or chemicals, where chemicals found in things like cigarette smoke, exhaust from cars, pesticides, or other toxins can damage the DNA. Most mutations are negative. Remember, if you mess with a gene, you mess with a protein. Without a functioning protein, traits are affected, disorders, deformities, and even death can occur. Mutations that occur in the junk DNA are often neutral. They have no effect on phenotype because that area of the DNA does not code for anything. Many mutations are neutral. Some mutations are positive or can be good. This is our ultimate source of variability, where new variations or alleles come from. However, this is a very rare event. Here are 3 facts that you need to know about mutation. 1. Mutations are the ultimate source of all genetic variations. This is where genetic variability comes from originally. 2. Mutations must be in the gametes of an organism to be passed on. If a mutation is localized someplace like your skin, those damaged genes are not going to be passed on to your offspring. Again, mutations have to be in the gametes, the eggs or the sperm cells, for that to be passed on to the next generation. Mutations are random. Organisms are not trying to evolve new traits. They don't want to change their DNA because generally the odds are against them, and that kind of change or mutation will be deadly. Occasionally we do have a mutation that doesn't kill and becomes a new allele or gene, but again, this is a random event, not something that organisms plan for. Mutations can cause evolution because you're introducing a brand new allele into the population, and this will change the allele frequencies. In our original population, all of the alleles were capital B. This means that the frequency of big B was 100%. After a mutation occurs, if it is not a deadly mutation, we now see the introduction of a little b in the population. This can change the allele frequencies. Now we have 99% big B and 1% little b. Over time, if that little b is beneficial, it will be passed on from generation to generation, and we see that the overall allele frequencies will change dramatically. This is evolution. Our second mechanism of evolution is genetic drift. Genetic drift involves random changes in allele frequencies of a population. This means that sometimes we see allele frequencies changing just due to random chance, like the roll of the dice. In the example shown here, cleft chin is a heritable trait, and it is dominant. The allele frequencies in human populations will drift or change randomly up and down from year to year. This is because neither one of these alleles is related to reproductive success. Inheritance is based solely on chance. We can see that the impacts of genetic drift are much greater in small populations than they are in large populations. In small populations, it is easy to lose alleles, and this can lead us to fixation when we see no variability left in the population. Fixation is when there's only one allele, and that allele has a frequency of 100%. Often in populations, we see that fixation occurs with negative traits, things like diseases or problematic genes. Genetic drift in general tends to reduce genetic variations in a population, which is a negative effect and can cause a great deal of issues and problems. There are two effects that can cause genetic drift. The first one is the founder effect. A small number of individuals leave a larger population and become the founding members of a new isolated population. This founding population will have different allele frequencies than the original population. The individuals who have left the original population have been randomly selected. One example of a founder effect is in the Amish population. If we look at the original population in Europe, there is a very low occurrence of the allele that codes for polydactyly, or extra digits on the hands and toes. When the Amish left England, it was a random group, random in respect to their genes, that came to settle in the colonies, now the United States. However, a large proportion of those new founders had the allele for polydactyly. We now see that this population of Amish in these states has a high occurrence of the gene and of the trait polydactyly, much higher than the original population. Another effect that can cause genetic drift is the population bottleneck. Bottleneck effect is when a large proportion of a population is killed off due to natural disaster. The individuals that die randomly, not based on their genes or any particular trait. After a bottleneck effect, the surviving population will have a very different allele frequency than the original population. A bottleneck effect has been seen in cheetah populations in Africa. Originally, the population had a great deal of genetic variation. After the bottleneck event, which was caused by human interactions, destruction of habitat, and humans hunting them, we see that the population now has very few alleles and that the variation is very low compared to that original population. Our third mechanism of evolution is gene flow, also known as migration. Gene flow is when we add or subtract alleles as individuals move in and out of a population. Individuals come and go, and their alleles go with them. Migration, or gene flow, actually prevents differences from building up in populations. This is kind of like mixing paint. If you mix a little bit of red with a little bit of blue, eventually both populations or both tubs of paint will be purple. So in this example, we see two populations separated by a mountain. Some of the population 1 migrates and joins population 2. This means that the two populations become more similar because they are mixed. Here's another example of gene flow. We have an original population of beetles on the left. These beetles have a very low frequency for the brown allele. We have an immigration event where 3 more beetles join the population. This group has a higher frequency of brown alleles. This is going to change our allele frequency in the current population, and it will also result in changes in the allele frequencies in the next generation of beetles. Our fourth mechanism of evolution is natural selection. Natural selection is caused by nature choosing traits that are best suited for one particular environment. Keep in mind, even though nature is choosing traits that are suited to the environment, evolution in general is not goal-oriented. Organisms are acted on by nature. They are not trying to evolve new traits or choosing what traits that they can have. Evolution has to work with variations already present in our population. So in this cartoon, we see that this beaver is trying to adapt a chainsaw so that it can quickly and efficiently cut down trees. This is not how evolution works. There was no genetic coding for that chainsaw to start with, so that beaver cannot will a chainsaw into being. There are three things that must occur for natural selection to work. The first is variations of a trait within a population. This means that a population has to have variations already present. The second thing is that these variations must be heritable, passed on from parent to offspring. The third thing that must occur is differential reproductive success. That means that one of the variations is better suited to the environment and allows that individual to reproduce more times than its competitors. Remember, during this process, nature gives traits value. So we're going to look at an example with some rabbits. We have two types of rabbits, and there are variations in the population. Some of the rabbits have thick hair, which is better for cold places. Some of the rabbits have shorter hair, which is not as good for these colder places. Okay, so these variations are within the alleles or the genes of the rabbits. Here's a picture of our two types of rabbit. We have a big fluffy bunny and a not so fluffy bunny. Because these traits are coded for in the genes, they are also heritable, which means that not so fluffy bunnies will have not so fluffy babies. Big fluffy bunnies will have big fluffy babies. These traits are going to have differential reproductive success. Some organisms, like the fluffy bunnies, will be better suited to their environment. The fluffy bunnies will be warmer and therefore have to spend less energy keeping warm, which gives them more energy to reproduce. Because these rabbits reproduce more than their competitors, the less fluffy bunnies, we say that differential reproductive success has occurred. This also means that the fluffy bunny is more fit than its competitors because it has more babies. So, fitness and the adaptations that we see do not always directly correlate with reproduction. Sometimes the traits allow an organism to be bigger or stronger, but those traits then allow those organisms to get more resources, food, water, space, or attract mates. The next step is reproduction. If you have more food, you can reproduce more because you have more energy. If you have more space, you have more room to raise more babies. If you have more mates, you can make more babies. Okay? Again, all of this boils down to fitness or reproductive success of an organism. So if we look back at our bunnies again, the thick-haired rabbits have many babies that all survive because they're all thick-furred. Shorter hair rabbits have fewer babies, but they do survive. So that the fluffy bunny is more fit than the less fluffy bunny. Keep in mind, though, that these traits are relative to their environment. If you take that big fluffy bunny and change the environment to a hot, dry place, that rabbit is not well adapted and he will die very quickly of heat exhaustion. He will not be able to produce very many babies before he dies, which means that this animal is not fit in that desert environment. Here's another example of how fitness depends on the specific environment where an organism lives. In this example, we have mice that live in two parts of the desert. In one part of the desert, the sand is light colored. The lighter colored mouse is able to blend in and avoid predation. This means that he will be able to survive longer and reproduce more often than the darker mouse who stands out and gets spotted by the predators. This can cause a change in the allele frequencies over time, and eventually most of our population will be white or light-colored mice that match the background. If we look at the other side of the desert where the sand is darker, the light-colored mouse is the one that stands out to the predators and gets picked off quickly and does not have a chance to reproduce as often. The darker mouse will be more fit because he is camouflaged and able to blend in. This allows him to survive longer and have more babies. Here we see again that the population will shift or change due to their environment, and most of our population over time will become brown mice rather than the lighter colored mice. Here's another example with some beetles. Organisms struggle to compete for resources that help them to survive. Their bottom line, the reason they survive, is to have babies. Okay, so these beetles come in two varieties, big beetles and little beetles. The larger beetles are able to reproduce more because they have more food, and this is attractive to the female beetles. We see that the smaller male beetle does get to reproduce, but not as often as the larger beetle. This means that the larger beetle will pass his genes on more often than the smaller beetle. This will cause a change in the population over time, and we'll see that the overall allele frequency will shift with larger beetles and larger alleles being more frequent. So remember, there are three things that have to occur before natural selection can happen. There have to be variations for traits. Those traits have to be heritable, passed on from parent to offspring. And we have to have differential reproductive success, where some versions of the trait allow some organisms to reproduce more often than the others. Natural selection is often said to be the survival of the fittest. This is often a misnomer. We can think about the fact that not all of our losers that are less fit die off right away. We think about those rabbits, the less fluffy bunny still survived, he still had babies, but he was not the most fit in the environment because he did not have as many babies as his competitor. So remember, when we're talking about survival of the fittest, we're talking about the genes being passed on to the next generation. The most fit genes, the ones that are best adapted to the environment, will survive into the next generation. Other genes may eventually become wiped out, but usually that takes a great deal of time. So we can think of fitness as a game. In the game of life, your bottom line is trying to pass your DNA on to the next generation. So the more fit you are, the more babies you have. The more babies you have, the more you win at life. And it's also important to note that you get double points for grandkids. Another point that we need to make about evolution. Evolution is not the road to perfection. Organisms are not working or evolving upwards towards being perfect or even towards betterness. If the environment changes, the best traits may now become the worst traits. So evolution, especially natural selection, is all relative to your environment. There are also examples of imperfections that have evolved over time. A great example of this is in the human eye. If we look at the back of each eye, there is actually a blind spot that occurs. We make up for this by having bifocal vision, two eyes, to compensate for each other. However, because of the structure and the build of our eye, there is that blind spot. That is not perfection, but it works. And it is advantageous, so it has been selected for and passed on, even with the imperfection present. The last thing with natural selection that we need to investigate are the patterns of natural selection. Natural selection can change the traits seen in a population in several ways. We are going to look at three patterns of natural selection. The first one is directional selection. We're going to start with our original population before evolution occurs. We're going to pretend that these are mice, and some of them have a white phenotype, some have a gray phenotype, and some have a black phenotype. We see from this graph that the majority of the mice have a gray phenotype. During directional selection, we see that the overall population will shift towards one extreme phenotype or the other. So after evolution, most of the individuals will have a darker black phenotype. So in directional selection, we see that the population has evolved in one direction or shifted in one direction. The second pattern of natural selection is stabilizing selection. Here's our original population again, where most of the mice have a gray phenotype. In stabilizing selection, the middle phenotype is selected for, which means that the extreme phenotypes, white and black, will decrease in frequencies. This means that our graph will show an even steeper peak in the middle. It kind of looks like the graph has been smushed towards the center. Okay, we are stabilizing the population around the mean, or the middle phenotype, in this case, the gray mice. The third pattern of natural selection is disruptive selection. This is when the middle phenotype is selected against and the two extreme phenotypes are selected for. This will cause the graph to become an M shape, where we have a lot of white mice, very few gray mice, and a lot of black mice in the population. Here's an example of directional selection. If we think about that desert we talked about before, and the sands change from a medium color to a darker color, the selective pressures will change as well. This means that there will be a directional shift or directional selection occurring on these mice. The evolved population will have more darker colored mice than lighter colored mice. We see stabilizing selection has occurred in human birth weights. If we look at very tiny babies, these are selected against. Tiny babies often are more vulnerable to complications. If we look at very large babies, they are also vulnerable to complications. So the middle weight or average size has been selected for, causing a stabilizing shift in our population. Disruptive selection occurs when the middle phenotype is selected against and the two extreme phenotypes are selected for. In this case, we have fish sizes. So the male fish, who are very large, are selected for by females to reproduce. So they get to reproduce very often. Males that are middle-sized are not selected by the females to reproduce. Males that are very small are sneaky reproducers. They sneak into a nest and fertilize the eggs before the female realizes what's going on. So they also get to reproduce very often. So because of these two strategies, we see that smaller fish reproduce often and are fit in our population. Large fish are fit in the population and get to reproduce often. But middle-sized males do not get to reproduce, and therefore there's a decrease in that size of fish. Remember, not all traits are subject to selection. If there is no value towards reproduction for a particular trait, like in cleft chin versus smooth chin, those traits will not be acted upon by natural selection. Instead, if we see changes in allele frequencies, it will be due to things like genetic drift or gene flow. In summary, we have covered the four major mechanisms of evolution. Be sure to review the learning objectives posted in Blackboard